June 19th, 1944, 10:32 a.m. Over the Philippine Sea, 150 miles west of Saipan, the cockpit of Lieutenant Junior Grade James Jim O'Neill's F-6F Hellcat rattled as he shoved the throttle forward, the Pratt and Whitney engine roaring like a living thing. Below him, the Pacific stretched flat and blinding, sunlight glinting off the water in hard white flashes. His headset crackled with clipped voices calm to the point of boredom. Bogies inbound. Angels 15. Multiple contacts. O'Neill glanced left, then right. Black specks filled the sky. They kept coming. The Japanese pilots approaching in loose formation. This scene should have felt familiar. Attacking American carrier groups had once been their specialty. But today something felt wrong. The airspace was crowded. Not with targets, but with defenders. O'Neill tightened his grip on the stick as his Hellcat climbed effortlessly, heavier than the Japanese Zeros below, yet faster, stronger, and, most critically, piloted by men who had trained for this exact moment again and again and again. The first Zero streaked past his nose. O'Neill rolled, dove, and squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns lit the sky. The Zero disintegrated in a spray of metal and flame. He barely had time to register the kill before another target appeared. And another. And another. For the Japanese aviators, this was not just a battle. It was the moment their entire air doctrine began to collapse in real time. Thousands of miles away, in Tokyo, senior naval planners had once believed battles like this would decide the war quickly. They had assumed the Americans would run out of ships, of pilots, of time. What they had never truly calculated was how many men the United States could train to fly, and how fast. 2 years earlier, in 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy still believed in the supremacy of the elite aviator. Their pilots were craftsmen, artists of the air, men like Saburo Sakai, trained through years of brutal selection, weeding out all but the best. Fewer pilots meant higher quality. That was the philosophy. It had worked at Pearl Harbor. It had worked in the early months of the war, but every victory carried a cost. Midway. At Guadalcanal, over Rabaul, each loss took with it something irreplaceable. Not just an aircraft, but a veteran with thousands of flight hours. Japan's training pipeline could not replace them quickly. It was never meant to die. In contrast, Jim O'Neill had been flying for less than 2 years. Back in Pensacola, Florida, he had logged hundreds of hours in trainers before ever touching a Hellcat. He practiced carrier landings until they were muscle memory, gunnery until his arms ached, emergency procedures until he could recite them half asleep. He had instructors rotated in from combat squadrons, men who taught him not how to fly, but how to survive. And he was just one of thousands that, in 1943 alone, American flight schools produced over 60,000 pilots across the Army and Navy. Airfields sprouted across the United States like factories. Texas, California, Kansas, Florida. Cadets marched, flew, washed out, or advanced. The system didn't depend on genius. It depended on volume. And volume was something Japan could not match. Back over the Philippine Sea, Japanese formation leaders tried to impose order. Hand signals flashed. Radios crackled with confusion. Many of the pilots flying that day had fewer than 200 hours in the air. Some had barely practiced deflection shooting. Others had never faced coordinated fighter direction guided by radar. They climbed anyway. The Americans were waiting. From the carriers USS Essex, Lexington, and Enterprise, wave after wave of Hellcats rose into the air. Fresh pilots rotated in. Fueled trucks refueled planes. Armorers reloaded belts. The machine kept moving. O'Neill saw a Zero attempt to tight turn below him. He smiled grimly and stayed high, remembering his instructor's voice. Don't dogfight. Dictate punto I dove. Fired. pulled away. Another kill. Down below, the ocean swallowed burning wreckage. Parachutes blossomed. Too low, too late. By noon, Japanese strike after strike had been shattered before ever reaching the American fleet. Pilots who survived fled back toward their carriers, chased all the way by relentless American fighters. This was not a duel of equals. That it was an industrial process playing out at 20,000 feet, and somewhere between the third and fourth intercepted wave, the truth became impossible to ignore. Japan was not losing because its pilots lacked courage. That it was losing because it had run out of experience, and the enemy had an endless supply of replacements. October 3rd, 1942. Naval Air Station, Corpus Christi, Texas. The sun hadn't fully risen when Seaman First Class Robert "Bobby" Hayes sprinted across the tarmac, flight helmet tucked under his arm, breath fogging in the cool Gulf air. Engines were already coughing to life in long, uneven rows. Yellow-painted trainers, scuffed and oil-streaked, but ready. Always ready, an instructor's whistle cut through the noise. Mount up. Hayes climbed into the cockpit of his SNJ Texan, fingers trembling slightly as he ran through the checklist. Fuel on. Mixture, rich. Magnetos, checked. Around him, dozens of other cadets did the same, moving in near-perfect synchronization. No speeches, no ceremony, just repetition. This was how America trained pilots, not as individual prodigies, but as components of a vast, grinding machine that ran from dawn until well past dark. Every day, waves of trainees took to the air. When one landed, another was already taxiing out. If a plane cracked a strut or blew a tire, it was dragged aside and replaced within minutes. If a cadet failed, washed out, froze under pressure, or clipped a wingtip on landing, his slot was filled before the sun set. The system did not pause in nearby classrooms. Navigation instructors tapped chalk against blackboards, teaching dead reckoning and radio fixes. In hangars, mechanics drilled students on emergency engine restarts, fuel fires, and ditching procedures. At night, pilots practiced instrument flying under hoods, learning to trust needles over instinct. Mistakes were expected. Losses were accounted for. This was the difference. Across the Pacific in Japan, flight training was still treated as a near-sacred art. Naval aviators were expected to be exceptional from the start. Selection was ruthless. Training was long. And above all, it was conservative. Pilots flew carefully to preserve aircraft. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition limited. Practice dogfights were restrained to avoid accidents. Every zero lost in training was a tragedy. Every American trainer lost was paperwork. WWII late 1942, Japanese instructors were already feeling the strain. Veteran pilots were pulled from the front to train new cadets, pilots who should have been fighting. The pool of experience thinned further. Training hours were shortened. Standards quietly lowered. In '01 in Tokyo wanted to admit what that meant. Back in Texas, Hayes lined up on the runway again. This time for carrier landing practice, simulated, of course. White lines painted on concrete. A signal officer waving paddles. Too high. Power back. Hayes slammed the throttle forward, corrected, and brought the plane down hard. The instructor's voice crackled in his headset, sharp but calm. You'd be dead on a real deck. Taxi clear. Hayes swallowed and nodded, heart pounding. Then he did it again, and again, and again. By the time he earned his wings, he would have attempted hundreds of landings. Some perfect, many sloppy, all logged, analyzed, corrected. When Hayes finally shipped out to the Pacific in early 1944, he would join a squadron where half the men had never seen combat, and where none of them were expected to survive on skill alone. They would survive on numbers. In Japan, the realization came slowly, and then all at once. After the Marianas Turkey shoot, surviving Japanese pilots reported something impossible. The Americans were not just better equipped, they were everywhere. Fresh pilots kept appearing. Even after heavy losses, American squadrons returned to full strength within days. Naval planners pored over reports, training estimates, replacement schedules. The math did not work. Japan could not replace pilots faster than they were being lost. The Americans could replace them faster than they could be killed. This was not how Japan had planned to fight a war, and it was not something bravery could fix. February 1st, 1944. Tokyo. Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Headquarters. Captain Masateko Kiyomiya stood silently at the edge of the conference room, eyes fixed on the map spread across the table. Red grease pencil marks tracked American carrier task forces advancing westward, island by island. Blue pins, Japanese air units, were fewer now. Too few that a junior officer finished reading the latest after-action report from the marshals. His voice wavered slightly as he reached the casualty figures. Air losses severe. Replacement pilots arrived without sufficient carrier qualification. Combat effectiveness dégradée. No one spoke. Okimiya had flown himself. He knew what the words meant. He also knew what they didn't say. Japan was flying out of pilots. For years, naval doctrine had insisted that quality would defeat quantity. A handful of elite aviators, properly trained, could smash any opponent. That belief had survived China. It had survived Pearl Harbor. It had even survived Midway. Barely. But now, the numbers on the table refused to be ignored. By early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was graduating fewer than 1,000 pilots per year. Many of them had less than half the flight hours of their predecessors. Fuel shortages meant airtime was cut again and again. Carrier landings were practiced less frequently. Live-fire gunnery was often skipped entirely. American production figures, capture intelligence, and intercepted radio traffic told a different story. The United States was training pilots faster than Japan could count them. And worse, those pilots were being rotated through combat, learning quickly, and then replaced only when necessary. Veteran instructors returned home. Lessons were codified. Mistakes were turned into manuals. Japan had no such system. Every lesson was paid for in blood, and then lost when the veteran who learned it failed to return. Thousands of miles away, Lieutenant Jim O'Neill was back aboard his carrier, boots slick with sweat and oil, watching deck crews hustle planes into position. He had flown 2 sorties already that day. Another was coming down. He barely registered the replacements arriving from the rear. They looked young. Some looked terrified, but they had all landed on a carrier before. They had all fired their guns in practice. They all knew the basics. That was enough. The Americans didn't need every pilot to be an ace. They needed them to be competent and replaceable. For Japanese commanders, the implications were devastating. Each experienced pilot lost now represented a permanent hole in the force. Squadrons became top-heavy with green flyers led by exhausted veterans. Formation discipline weekend. Tactical cohesion frayed. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, entire attack waves dissolved before reaching their targets. Pilots broke formation, missed rendezvous points, failed to identify enemy ships correctly. American radar-guided fighters intercepted them long before they could strike. Back in Tokyo, the phrase began to circulate quietly among staff officers. The decisive battle has already been lost. Not at sea, but in the schools. The final desperate solution emerged later that year that if pilots could not be trained fast enough, they would not need to return. The special attack units, kamikaze, were born from this brutal arithmetic. One-way missions required minimal training. A few weeks of flight time. Enough to take off. Enough to AIM.IT was an admission of defeat disguised as sacrifice. Japan had reached the end of its pipeline. The Americans had not even slowed theirs. October 25th, 1944. Off the coast of Leyte, Philippine Sea. The sky was low and gray, clouds hanging like a lid over the battle below. Lieutenant, junior grade, Robert Hayes, no longer a trainee, no longer shaking, gripped the controls of his Hellcat as the carrier USS Intrepid fell away beneath him. This was his sixth combat mission. He had been in the Pacific less than 3 months. Ahead, radar had picked up incoming aircraft. Not a coordinated strike, a scatter. That alone told Hayes everything he needed to know. Bandits, 12 o'clock. Low. He spotted them moments later. Single-engine aircraft flying straight and fast, engines screaming, ignoring interception warnings. No evasive maneuvers. No formation discipline. One of the older pilots in his section spoke quietly over the radio. Kamikazes. Hayes swallowed hard. Down below, Japanese Zero and Val pilots pushed their throttles forward and kept them there. Some wore headbands. Some carried letters. Many barely understood the tactical situation around them. Their orders were simple. Hit something. Anything. The transformation of Japanese air power was now complete. Where once elite pilots had stalked the skies with precision and patience, now barely trained men hurled themselves forward in desperate, terminal attacks. For American pilots, the fight had changed, but not slowed. Hayes lined up on a diving aircraft and fired. The enemy plane burst apart in midair. No evasive turn, no return fire, just impact and fire. Another kill that he didn't feel triumph. Only a tightening in his chest that in Japan, senior naval officers understood what this moment represented. The doctrine of elite air superiority, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was finished. The numbers told the story clearly now. WWII late 1944. The United States had trained hundreds of thousands of aircrew. Entire carrier air groups could be rebuilt in weeks. New pilots arrived with standardized training, combat-tested tactics, and aircraft designed to forgive mistakes. Japan could no longer even train enough instructors. Fuel shortages reduced flight hours to the bare minimum. Wooden trainers replaced metal aircraft. Students practiced takeoffs without landings. Landings without takeoffs. The system had collapsed. Back over Leyte Gulf, Hayes watched as another kamikaze slipped through and struck a carrier in the distance. Smoke rose. Damage control teams went to work. The ship stayed afloat. Another aircraft tried the same approach minutes later. It never reached its target. American fighters circled constantly, rotating pilots in shifts, backed by radar, radios, and logistics that never stopped. When one pilot grew tired, another took his place. Japan had no such luxury. Its elite had been consumed. Its replacements rushed. Its future pilots already spent. That night, as Hayes sat on the deck with his back against the island structure, listening to the ocean slap against steel, he realized something quietly astonishing. He was alive not because he was exceptional, but because the system behind him was. The Japanese planners had once believed they could win the air war with fewer, better men. They never imagined facing an enemy who could train pilots faster than war itself could kill them. August 10th, 1945. Yokosuka Naval Air Base, Japan. The airfield was silent. Rows of aircraft sat motionless beneath the summer sun, some missing engines, others cannibalized beyond repair. Weeds crept through cracks in the concrete. Inside a half-darkened operations building, Captain Masatake Okumiya studied a final report, its pages thin from reuse, its numbers unmistakable. There were almost no pilots left. Not enough to defend the homeland. Not enough to fly the remaining aircraft. Not enough to matter. The Emperor had not yet spoken publicly, but everyone in the room understood what was coming. The war had reached its conclusion long before this moment. Long before the firebombing of Tokyo, long before the atomic bomb at IT had ended when Japan's pilot pipeline collapsed, in the final months, training had become almost symbolic. Cadets flew a handful of hours, sometimes never soloing before being assigned to operational units. Fuel was so scarce that instructors demonstrated maneuvers on the ground with chalk and hand motions. There was no illusion left. Japan had built an air force designed to win a short war with decisive early blows. When that war stretched into years, the system broke under its own weight that America's system did not. Across the Pacific, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, now a combat veteran, stood on the deck of his carrier as word spread through the fleet. The Japanese had surrendered. Men cheered. Some laughed. Others sat down and stared at nothing. Hayes thought back to his first day in Texas. The shouted commands, the endless landings, the instructors who treated mistakes like expected data points instead of personal failures. He understood now what they had been preparing him for. Not just combat, replacement. The United States had not won the air war by producing better individual pilots. Many Japanese aviators remained superior dogfighters to the very end. What America produced was something far more dangerous, a system that assumed loss and planned for it, a system where experience was captured, written down, and taught to the next class, that a system that turned training into an assembly line without stripping it of effectiveness. That be why in 1945, Japan had courage left, IT had aircraft left, IT had targets left. What it did not have was time or pilots. For Japanese naval planners, the final realization was brutal in its simplicity. The war had not been decided in the skies over Midway or Leyte Gulf. That IT had been decided in classrooms, on training fields, that on runways where one nation could afford to let pilots fail and another could not.